In the autumn of 1888, a series of brutal murders in the East End of London lit a flame that sent shockwaves reverberating around the civilised world and caused a scandal that struck right at the heart of the British establishment.
Elizabeth Long saw Annie Chapman at 5:30 in the morning outside number 27 Hanbury Street. Mrs. Long, who knew Annie by sight because they often stayed in the same common lodging house, told the police that Annie was not on her own. She was in the company of a man Mrs. Long described as dark and swarthy, a foreigner.
A little before 6 a.m. on the 8th of September 1888, John Davis, an elderly resident at number 29 Hanbury Street, came downstairs, walked along the narrow passageway and opened the back door. The sight that he saw shook him to his bones. Moments later, two workmen walking along Hanbury Street were suddenly startled when the door of number 29 burst open and a wild-eyed old man stumbled into the street. "Men," he cried, "come here." Nervously, they followed him down the passageway, and looking into the backyard, they saw the body of Annie Chapman lying between the steps and the fence.
Annie Chapman's throat was cut in two places, sort of two sections of cutting. She'd been ripped up to the breastbone. The small intestines were taken out of the body and placed over her right shoulder, and then two smaller flaps from the lower abdomen were placed over her left shoulder.
And there, in the corner of the yard, lay a freshly washed leather apron. The three previous murders had certainly caused disquiet in Whitechapel, but with the death of Annie Chapman, something happened. That disquiet gave way to panic and hysteria, as mobs began to turn their anger on anyone whom they thought might be responsible. The fact that a washed leather apron had been found so close to Annie's body led to anti-Semitism, and innocent Jews were threatened and abused by angry crowds.
It soon transpired that the leather apron found at the scene of the murder belonged to one of the residents of number 29 Hanbury Street and was not in any way connected to the murder or the murderer. This knowledge, however, did little to quell the racial unrest. As one newspaper reported, a touch would fire the whole district in the mood in which it is in now.
It was a widely held belief in the area that the authorities cared little for the fates of those who lived hereabouts. The inadequacy of local policing had long been a bone of contention, and the fact that the Home Office point-blank refused to sanction a reward for information that might lead to the killer's identity rankled with the local residents. The foreman of the jurors at the inquest into Annie Chapman's death even went so far as to express the view that the murders of both Chapman and Nichols might easily have been prevented had the government offered a reward in the wake of Martha Tabram's killing.
The government itself did not offer a reward. The Prime Minister and the Home Secretary were against offering rewards. This had been a policy that had been introduced by an earlier Home Secretary, so they were merely following a standard practice.
Anxious to assist the police investigation, several local residents began their own private endeavours and formed vigilance committees in the hope of bringing the killer to justice.
The vigilance committees are an important part of the Jack the Ripper case. They did have certain beats and they had their own patrols, but the most important of all of the vigilance committees was that run by the President, George Lusk, and the sort of Mile End committee formed on the 10th of September 1888. Now that was very organised. These were, although a lot of the members were unemployed, a lot of them were local people, local men, they were organised, but they not only patrolled the streets on beats, as I said, with a police whistle, a stick and galoshes on the regular beats. They also did lots of other things like physically writing to people to try and get things changed. They wrote to the government, to the Queen, to the Home Office. So they weren't just sort of groups of mobs on the streets.
On the 10th of September, Sergeant William Thick went round to number 22 Mulberry Street and arrested John Pizer. there is little doubt that the police were convinced that Pizer was the man known as Leather Apron, and so as Sergeant Thick escorted him into Leman Street Police Station, feeling must have been running high that the Whitechapel murderer had been caught. But under interrogation, Pizer was able to provide cast iron alibis for the nights of the two most recent murders, and the police quickly ruled him out as a suspect. He even appeared at Annie Chapman's inquest, where he was given the opportunity to publicly clear his name.
It was at that inquest that Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the police surgeon who had examined Annie Chapman's body as it lay in the backyard of number 29 Hanbury Street, raised the chilling possibility. The fact that her killer had removed her womb, he stated, suggested that the reason for her murder may well have been to obtain that particular part of her anatomy. Furthermore, the speed with which he did it and the skill displayed hinted that he may well have possessed some anatomical knowledge.
The question of medical knowledge or surgical skill, we have to make the distinction between anatomical knowledge, meaning knowing where the organs are and where to find them, and surgical skill, which is the ability to actually extract them. The question is difficult to answer. Some of the doctors at the time thought that he had both. Some thought that he had the anatomical knowledge, the kind of knowledge that a horse slaughterer or a butcher or somebody like that would have had, but not necessarily a surgical skill. Another doctor said that it would have taken him, in those circumstances, a lot longer to have committed the mutilations, and so therefore there was surgical skill exhibited. Other people said no surgical skills, no anatomical knowledge, just did what he did, and it was lucky that he found whatever it was that he found.
With the police apparently unable to catch the murderer, rumours began to circulate about his identity and motives. Was he a butcher, a slaughterman, a doctor, a medical student, or even a sailor on one of the ships in the nearby port of London? Was he seeking revenge for some imagined or real injury he had suffered at the hands of a prostitute? Was he a member of some heathen sect carrying out a barbaric ritual? Was he simply seeking notoriety? Or was he on a moral crusade to clear the streets of Whitechapel of the sin of prostitution?
I wouldn't have thought that Jack the Ripper was necessarily targeting prostitutes at all. He may have been, we have no idea, but we don't know who Jack the Ripper was, so we have no real idea of what his motives would have been. It's really a case of paying your money and taking your choice, but I think it's more likely that he was interested specifically in targeting women and was just trying to destroy women.
Many who lived in the neighbourhood were convinced that they at least knew his occupation.
There was a rumour going around Whitechapel that he might have been a slaughterman, for the simple reason that there were many slaughterhouses in Whitechapel that were active in the early hours of the morning. Meat was being killed, fresh, for there was no refrigeration. So it would be killed in the early hours and put in the butchers at 6 a.m. And let's face it, slaughtermen wore large leather aprons that would be heavily stained with blood. What a perfect disguise for Jack the Ripper. Maybe he was even one of those himself. Let's face it, dressed like that, he could wander the streets of Whitechapel like he was invisible.
The police themselves were rapidly coming round to the view that the murderer was probably a lunatic and that he possibly possessed surgical knowledge. To that end, several medical students who had recently spent time in asylums were traced and interviewed. But as with so many avenues of inquiry, this one also led to a dead end, and one by one, the students were exonerated of any involvement in the crimes.
The beleaguered police officers were now coming under increased criticism from the press and public alike for their inability to catch the killer. But was that criticism justified?
The police investigation, generally speaking, was handled as well as it could be. It's difficult to know what else they could have done. They basically just did everything that they possibly could, but there were no clues, and this was a point that Sir Robert Anderson made in a memo to the Home Office. And he said, that for one murder to occur with the murderer leaving no clue was remarkable, but for a number of murders to have taken place with the murderer leaving no clue was absolutely extraordinary.
On the 24th of September, George Bernard Shaw wrote to the Star newspaper and offered his own intriguing theory for the killer's motives.
Sir, will you allow me to make a comment on the success of the Whitechapel murderer in calling attention for a moment to the social question? Private enterprise has succeeded where socialism failed. Whilst we conventional social democrats were wasting our time on education, agitation and organization, some independent genius has taken the matter in hand, and by simply murdering and disemboweling 4 women, converted the proprietary press to an inept sort of communism.
No doubt, Shaw's tongue was very firmly in his cheek when he suggested that the murderer was a social reformer, but there is little doubt that the Whitechapel murders had succeeded in drawing attention to the dreadful living conditions in the area. Several of the improvements that took place over the next few years can indeed be attributed to the increased awareness that the killings had focused on the neighbourhood.